My wife ignored me at my father's funeral to sit with her ex-husband. I watched my wife slide into the church pew next to her ex-husband during my father's funeral and realized she wasn't planning to sit with me at all. She wore the black dress I'd bought her for my mother's funeral 3 years ago, and she'd done her hair the way she used to style it when we were dating, soft curls that framed her face. Her ex-husband, Damien, wore an expensive charcoal suit I'd never seen before and had his arms stretched across the back of the pew behind her shoulders. They were sitting in the third row on the left side, and I was standing at the front near my father's casket, staring at them both, while the organist played something slow and mournful that I couldn't name. My hands held the eulogy I'd written at 3 a.m, and the paper was damp from my sweating palms. Damien looked at me and smiled slightly. Not friendly, but not hostile either, just acknowledging that he saw me seeing them together. My wife, Rebecca, didn't look at me at all. The funeral director, a thin man named Arthur Pemberton, touched my elbow and asked quietly if I was ready to begin. I nodded and walked to the lectern, while about 80 people watched me from the wooden pews. My father had been a high school principal for 30 years, and half the attendees were former students or faculty members who'd come to pay respects. My older brother, Ian, sat in the front row with his wife and their 2 kids. My younger sister, Olivia, sat beside them with her girlfriend. There was an empty space next to Olivia where Rebecca should have been sitting, where my wife was supposed to sit during the worst day of my life. Instead, she was 3 rows back with the man she'd been married to before me, the man she'd divorced 8 years ago after he cheated on her with someone from his office. I'd met Rebecca 2 years after that divorce, and she'd told me Damien was completely out of her life. She'd said she never wanted to see him again after what he'd done to her. I started reading the eulogy about how my father taught me to fish and helped me fix my first car and showed up to every single one of my baseball games growing up. My voice came out steady, even though I could see Rebecca whispering something to Damien. He leaned closer to hear her better, and his hand moved from the pew to her shoulder. I stumbled over a sentence about my father's dedication to education and had to read it again. Ian glanced back at Rebecca and Damien, then looked at me with confusion written across his face. After the service ended, people filed past the casket to pay final respects before heading to the cemetery. I stood near the front receiving condolences and handshakes. Rebecca walked past with Damien right behind her. She touched my arm briefly and said she was sorry for my loss, her voice quiet and formal, like she was talking to a distant acquaintance. Damien extended his hand for me to shake. I stared at his hand until he lowered it. He said something about my father being a good man, then followed Rebecca toward the exit. My brother caught up with me in the vestibule and asked what the hell was going on with Rebecca and her ex. I said I didn't know because I genuinely didn't know. Ian's wife, Melissa, joined us and said she'd seen Rebecca and Damien talking in the parking lot before the service started. She said they'd been laughing about something, actually laughing, right before walking into my father's funeral. Olivia appeared and asked if I knew Rebecca had invited Damien. I told her I had no idea Rebecca had even been in contact with Damien, let alone invited him to something as personal as my father's funeral. The 4 of us stood there in a small cluster, while other mourners walked past us toward their cars. My sister suggested maybe Damien had just shown up on his own, but Melissa said no. She'd definitely seen them arrive together in the same car, Damien's black luxury sedan that she recognized because it had been parked at our house twice in the last month when she'd stopped by to drop off mail that had been delivered to her address by mistake. I'd been married to Rebecca for 5 years, together for 7 total. We'd bought a house in a neighborhood with good schools, even though we didn't have kids yet. We'd talked about starting a family after I finished my graduate degree in civil engineering, and she got her promotion at the marketing firm where she worked. She'd been supportive when my father got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 6 months ago, coming with me to doctor appointments and helping me research treatment options. She'd held my hand when the oncologist, Dr. Raymond Cho, told us the cancer was stage 4 and had metastasized to my father's liver. She'd helped me coordinate hospice care when treatment stopped working. She'd been there through everything, or at least I'd thought she was there. Now I was standing in the church vestibule learning she'd been meeting with her ex-husband secretly while my father was dying. The cemetery service was brief and cold. November wind cut through my suit jacket while the priest said final prayers over the casket. Rebecca stood about 15 feet away from me with Damien beside her. She had her arms wrapped around herself against the wind, and Damien took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. The gesture looked practiced and familiar, like something he'd done many times before. I watched my father's casket get lowered into the ground and felt nothing except a strange numbness that started in my chest and spread outward. After the burial, people gathered at my parents' house for a reception. My mother had died 3 years earlier from a stroke, so Ian and Olivia and I had organized everything ourselves, ordering food from a catering company and setting up folding tables in the living room and dining room. Rebecca was already there when I arrived, having ridden with Damien from the cemetery. She was in the kitchen arranging cookies on a serving platter, and Damien was helping her, handing her things from bakery boxes. I walked into the kitchen and asked Rebecca if we could talk privately. She glanced at Damien before answering. She said now wasn't a good time because people were arriving and needed food set out. I told her I didn't care about the food, and needed to understand why her ex-husband was at my father's funeral. Damien interjected and said he'd come to support Rebecca during a difficult time. I asked how my father's death was difficult for Rebecca when she'd barely known him. My father and Rebecca had never been particularly close. He'd been polite to her, but distant, probably because he'd been grieving my mother and hadn't had much emotional energy for getting to know his son's wife. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, and she said I was being cruel. Damien stepped between us and suggested I should calm down because I was clearly upset and not thinking straight. I told Damien to get out of my dead father's house. He said he was there at Rebecca's invitation and would leave when she asked him to leave, not before. Olivia came into the kitchen and asked what was happening. I explained that I wanted Damien to leave and Rebecca was refusing to ask him to go. Olivia looked at Rebecca and said, maybe it would be better if Damien left given the circumstances. Rebecca started crying harder and said everyone was ganging up on her. Damien put his arm around her and told Olivia that Rebecca needed support right now. Olivia's face hardened and she asked Damien who he thought he was, showing up at a funeral for a man he'd never met and acting like he belonged there. Damien said he'd met my father twice actually, at events Rebecca had brought him to recently. This was news to me. I asked Rebecca when she'd taken Damien to meet my father. She said it wasn't important, and I was making a scene. I raised my voice and said my father's funeral reception was absolutely the time to make a scene about her bringing her ex-husband around without telling me. Ian entered the kitchen and the space suddenly felt overcrowded with 6 people standing between the counter and the refrigerator. Ian asked what was going on, and I filled him in quickly. Ian turned to Damien and asked him to leave politely. Damien refused again and said he wasn't going anywhere while Rebecca was this upset. Ian's voice got harder, and he said this was our father's house, and Damien wasn't welcome here. Damien argued that Rebecca had just as much right to invite guests as anyone else since she was family through marriage. The conversation was escalating into a confrontation when my father's sister, my Aunt Patricia, walked in asking if there was more coffee made. She stopped when she saw all of us standing there with tense faces and raised voices. She asked what was wrong, and Ian explained the situation. Aunt Patricia looked at Damien and asked who he was. When we told her he was Rebecca's ex-husband, she told him to leave immediately. Damien looked at Rebecca and she finally nodded. He kissed her cheek before walking out, and that kiss landed like a punch to my stomach. The reception continued awkwardly with people eating sandwiches and sharing memories of my father, while I stood in the corner trying to process what had happened. Rebecca avoided me for the next 2 hours, staying busy refilling drinks and clearing plates. When the last guests finally left around 6 in the evening, Ian and Olivia and I sat in the living room among the debris of empty serving platters and crumpled napkins. Rebecca was in the kitchen loading the dishwasher. Melissa had taken Ian's kids home earlier so the 3 of us could talk freely. Ian said he'd had a strange feeling about Rebecca lately but hadn't wanted to say anything without proof. Olivia said she'd noticed Rebecca being distant at family dinners for the past few months. I admitted I'd been so focused on my father's illness and my graduate thesis that I hadn't been paying attention to my marriage. We sat there quietly for a while before I got up and went into the kitchen. Rebecca was wiping down counters when I asked her directly how long she'd been seeing Damien again. She stopped wiping and turned to face me. She said she'd reconnected with him 4 months ago when they'd run into each other at a conference in Chicago. They'd both been there for work. Her company and his company were in related industries, and they'd ended up having coffee to catch up. She said it started as friendship, but had developed into something more. I asked if she was sleeping with him. Rebecca looked at the floor and said yes. She said she'd been unhappy in our marriage for over a year, and Damien had reminded her of what passion felt like. I asked why she'd brought him to my father's funeral of all places. She said Damien had been supporting her through a hard time and she'd wanted him there. I pointed out that I was the one losing a father and going through a hard time. Rebecca said she knew that, but she'd needed support too, because watching me grieve had been emotionally draining for her. I left my father's house without another word and drove to the hotel where Olivia was staying. She was in town from Seattle and had booked a room near the airport. She let me into her room and ordered room service while I sat on the edge of her bed and explained everything Rebecca had admitted. Olivia listened and then said she'd never trusted Rebecca completely, that something had always felt performative about how Rebecca acted in family settings. I'd never noticed it before, but thinking back, I could see what Olivia meant. Rebecca had always seemed like she was playing the role of devoted wife, rather than actually being devoted. She'd done all the right things, said all the right words, but there'd been a hollowness underneath it all that I'd mistaken for reserve or shyness. Olivia asked what I was going to do. I said I didn't know yet. She suggested I stay in her hotel room for the night, rather than going home to face Rebecca. I agreed and slept on the pull-out sofa while Olivia took the bed. The next morning I drove to the house I shared with Rebecca. Her car wasn't in the driveway. I went inside and found a note on the kitchen counter saying she'd gone to Damien's apartment and would be back later to talk. I walked through our house looking at everything differently now. The wedding photos on the wall showed Rebecca smiling, but the smile didn't reach her eyes in most of them. The furniture we'd picked out together suddenly felt like props in a stage production. I sat on the couch we'd bought at a Labor Day sale and called my friend Keith, who was a divorce attorney. Keith had gone to law school with me before I'd switched to engineering. He answered on the third ring, and I explained the situation. Keith said I should document everything, get copies of financial records, and avoid confronting Rebecca until I had legal representation. He gave me the name of a colleague, attorney Lisa Brennan, who specialized in family law and had 18 years of experience handling difficult divorces. I spent the next 3 hours photographing financial documents, bank statements, and emails between Rebecca and Damien that I found on our shared computer. Rebecca had been careless about deleting her correspondence. The emails went back 5 months, not 4 like she'd claimed. They'd been meeting regularly, sometimes twice a week, at hotels and restaurants across the city. Damien had sent her flowers multiple times. There were emails planning secret getaways and discussing how to keep their relationship hidden from me. One email from Damien referenced how Rebecca had complained about me being boring and too focused on my dying father. That particular email was dated 3 weeks before my father passed away. Rebecca had been sharing intimate details of my grief with her ex-husband, and they'd both been mocking me for it. I printed everything and put it in a folder. Rebecca came home around 3 in the afternoon. She looked surprised to see me there. She'd probably expected me to still be at Olivia's hotel or helping Ian clean out our father's house. I was sitting at the dining table with the folder of printed emails in front of me. Rebecca saw the papers and her face went pale. She asked what I was doing, and I told her I was preparing for our divorce. She sat down across from me and said we should talk about this before making rash decisions. I asked if sleeping with her ex-husband for 5 months and bringing him to my father's funeral was a rash decision. Rebecca said the situation was complicated, and I wouldn't understand unless I listened to her perspective. I told her I'd found the emails where she and Damien had laughed about my father's illness. Rebecca's expression shifted, and she said those emails were taken out of context. I stood up and told Rebecca I wanted her out of the house by the end of the week. She said this was her house too, since we owned it jointly. I said I'd buy her out of her share, but I wanted her gone. Rebecca started crying and said I was being unreasonable. She said yes, she'd made mistakes, but we could work through this if I was willing to try. I asked if she was still planning to see Damien. She hesitated, and then admitted she loved him. She said she'd never stopped loving him completely, that when we'd met, she'd thought she was over him, but she'd just been running from her feelings. She said meeting him again in Chicago had made her realize she'd married me for the wrong reasons. I'd been safe and stable, and the opposite of Damien in every way, and she'd convinced herself that was what she wanted. But being with Damien again had reminded her that safety and stability weren't enough. She needed excitement and passion, things she said I couldn't provide. I told Rebecca to pack a bag and leave for the night. She refused, and said she had just as much right to stay in the house as I did. I called Keith and put him on speakerphone. He told Rebecca that given the circumstances, it would be in her best interest to find alternative accommodation while we worked out the divorce details. He said if she refused to leave voluntarily, I could file for a restraining order based on emotional distress. Rebecca said that was ridiculous, and Keith couldn't enforce anything. Keith calmly explained that he wasn't enforcing anything. He was simply advising what legal options were available. Rebecca looked at me with something like hatred in her eyes. She said fine, she'd stay with Damien, and at least he appreciated her. She went upstairs and packed 2 suitcases, then left without saying goodbye. I sat alone in the house listening to the silence and feeling nothing except exhausted. The following Monday, I met with attorney Lisa Brennan in her office downtown. The waiting room had leather chairs and recent magazines, and a receptionist who offered me coffee while I waited. Lisa was in her early 50s with short gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She reviewed the emails and financial documents I'd brought. She asked detailed questions about our assets and how long we'd been married and whether Rebecca had any claim to my inheritance from my father's estate. I explained that my father's will left everything to his 3 children equally, and since he'd just died, probate hadn't even begun yet. Lisa said that was fortunate because it meant Rebecca had no legal claim to any inheritance. She asked about the house, and I explained we'd bought it 3 years ago with a joint mortgage. Lisa said we'd need to get the property appraised and determine equity division. She asked if I had any evidence of Rebecca's infidelity beyond the emails. I said I had witnesses who saw her with Damien at the funeral. Lisa made notes and said witness testimony would help, but photographs or additional documentation would be stronger. She asked if I'd considered hiring a private investigator. I hadn't thought of that. Lisa gave me the contact information for an investigator named Michael Garrett, who'd worked on several of her cases. She said Michael was discreet and thorough and charged reasonable rates. I called Michael that afternoon and explained the situation. He said he could start surveillance immediately and would provide a full report with photographic evidence within 2 weeks. His fee was $200 per day plus expenses. I agreed and gave him Rebecca's work address and Damien's apartment location, which I'd found in the emails. Over the next 10 days, Michael followed Rebecca and Damien documenting their relationship. He sent me daily updates with time-stamped photographs. Rebecca leaving work and driving to Damien's apartment. Rebecca and Damien having dinner at expensive restaurants. Rebecca and Damien checking into a hotel together on a Friday night. The photographs were damning and specific and made everything real in a way that hurt worse than the emails. Michael compiled everything into a professional report with sworn affidavits about what he'd witnessed. He'd even recorded video of Rebecca and Damien kissing in a parking garage. I paid his fee and added his report to the growing folder of evidence. Lisa reviewed everything and said we had an extremely strong case for divorce based on adultery. She said, given the evidence, Rebecca would have difficulty arguing for anything beyond her legal minimum entitlement. Ian called me on a Saturday morning and said he'd been going through our father's papers and found something strange. He asked if I could come over to his house. I drove across town and found Ian in his home office surrounded by file boxes. He showed me our father's journal, a leather-bound book where he'd written periodic entries over the last 5 years. Most entries were mundane observations about his students or notes about gardening. But there were 3 entries about Rebecca. The first entry, dated 2 years ago, said Ian had introduced Rebecca to a colleague at a retirement party, and my father had noticed how much Rebecca had flirted with the man despite being married to me. The second entry, dated 1 year ago, mentioned my father seeing Rebecca having lunch with someone who wasn't me at a restaurant downtown. He'd thought about mentioning it, but decided he might have been mistaken. The third entry, dated 6 months ago, said he'd seen Rebecca's car parked outside a hotel on a Monday afternoon when she was supposed to be at work. My father had suspected Rebecca of cheating for at least 2 years, but never said anything to me. Ian said he felt guilty reading our father's private thoughts, but thought I should know. I asked why our father hadn't told me what he'd seen. Ian said our father probably hadn't wanted to interfere in my marriage without proof, or maybe he'd hoped he was wrong about his suspicions. I sat in Ian's office reading the journal entries in my father's handwriting and felt anger building. Rebecca had been lying to me for years, while my father watched and worried and stayed silent. I took photographs of the relevant journal pages and added them to my evidence folder. Lisa said the journal entries were hearsay, but would help establish a pattern of suspicious behavior that corroborated the investigators' findings. Everything was coming together for the divorce filing. Rebecca called me on a Wednesday evening asking if we could meet to discuss things civilly. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near our house. She arrived looking tired with dark circles under her eyes. She ordered an herbal tea and sat across from me at a small table near the window. She said Damien had been pressuring her to finalize our divorce quickly so they could get married. I asked if she was planning to marry him. Rebecca said yes, probably, if things continued going well. She said they'd been talking about moving to Denver where Damien had a job opportunity. She wanted to know what I was asking for in the divorce settlement. I told her I wanted the house and would buy out her share at a fair market value. She said that seemed reasonable. I said I also wanted her to acknowledge fault in the divorce based on her adultery. Rebecca's expression changed, and she said she wouldn't agree to that because it would affect her reputation. I pulled out my phone and showed her some of Michael's photographs. Rebecca's hands started shaking when she saw the images. She asked if I'd had her followed. I said yes, and I had a comprehensive report documenting her affair, including dates, times, locations, and photographic evidence. I also had the emails and witness statements and my father's journal entries. Rebecca put her head in her hands and started crying. She said I was being vindictive and cruel. I reminded her that she'd brought her lover to my father's funeral and had been mocking my grief behind my back for months. I said compared to that, hiring a private investigator seemed remarkably restrained. Rebecca said if I filed for divorce on fault grounds, it would humiliate her publicly. I told her she should have thought about public humiliation before conducting an affair so carelessly. She asked what I wanted from her. I said I wanted the house. I wanted her to sign a quitclaim deed giving up any rights to my father's inheritance, and I wanted her to pay half the legal fees and investigation costs. Rebecca said that was too much. I said the alternative was taking everything to court, where a judge would see all the evidence and likely rule in my favor anyway, except it would cost both of us considerably more money and time. Rebecca asked if she signed everything. Would I agree to keep the details private? I said I'd have no reason to share the details publicly if she cooperated with the divorce terms. She asked for 20 hours to think about it. I said she had until Friday at 5 to decide. If she didn't agree by then, I'd file in court, and everything would become public record. Rebecca left the coffee shop without finishing her tea. Friday afternoon at 3, Rebecca's attorney, a man named Gerald Foster, who'd been recommended by Damien apparently, called Lisa's office to negotiate. I sat in Lisa's conference room while she put the call on speakerphone. Gerald said his client was willing to agree to most of our terms, but wanted the language about fault removed from the divorce filing. Lisa said that was non-negotiable given the extensive evidence we had. Gerald argued that fault-based divorce was outdated and unnecessarily punitive. Lisa said her client had been humiliated at his father's funeral by his wife's flagrant affair and had every right to seek a fault-based divorce. Gerald said Rebecca was willing to forfeit her share of the house and pay half the legal fees if we agreed to no-fault language. Lisa looked at me, and I shook my head. She told Gerald the offer was rejected. Gerald said he'd need to consult with his client. He called back an hour later and said Rebecca agreed to all terms, including the fault-based filing. Lisa drafted the divorce agreement, and both parties signed it the following Wednesday. Rebecca came to Lisa's office looking defeated and signed every page without reading them thoroughly. Gerald advised her to read everything carefully, but she said she just wanted it over with. The signing took less than 30 minutes. Rebecca handed over the keys to our house and signed the quitclaim deed. She'd already moved all her personal belongings out over the previous week, while I'd stayed at Ian's house to avoid seeing her. After Rebecca left, Lisa said the whole process had gone remarkably smoothly, given how contentious these situations usually became. She said we'd file the papers with the court on Thursday, and the divorce would be final in 60 days pending the mandatory waiting period. I thanked her for her work and wrote her a check for the remaining legal fees. I drove back to the house that was now entirely mine. The rooms felt empty, even though all my furniture was still there. Rebecca had taken the decorative items she'd chosen, things like throw pillows and wall art, and the fancy dishes we'd gotten as wedding gifts. The bare spots on the walls showed darker rectangles where frames had hung. I walked through each room cataloging what was missing and what remained. In the bedroom, she'd taken her clothes and jewelry and the framed photo of her parents that had sat on her nightstand. She'd left behind a bottle of perfume on the bathroom counter, probably forgotten in her rush to pack everything else. The scent reminded me of when we'd first started dating, and she'd worn that same perfume to our third date. I threw the bottle in the trash. Ian and Olivia came over on Saturday to help me sort through my father's belongings that we'd moved into my garage. We spent hours going through boxes of his clothes and books and paperwork. Olivia found my father's wedding ring in a small box of jewelry and said she thought I should have it since I was the middle child and hadn't received as many family heirlooms as Ian and her. Ian agreed, and I put the ring in my pocket. We found photographs of our parents from when they were young and newly married. My mother looked radiant in the pictures, and my father looked proud standing beside her. They'd been married for 30 years before my mother's stroke. I'd always assumed I'd have that kind of lasting marriage too. Finding out Rebecca had been lying for years destroyed that assumption. We finished sorting through the boxes by evening and divided everything among the three of us. Olivia took most of the photographs to scan and preserve digitally. Ian took my father's tools and some of his books. I kept his journals and some of his clothing that still smelled like his aftershave. Damien called my cell phone on a Monday night 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. He said he wanted to apologize for how everything had happened. I asked why he thought I'd want his apology. Damien said he understood I was angry, but he hoped eventually we could all be civil since he and Rebecca were getting married. I told him I had no intention of ever being civil with him or Rebecca, and he should never contact me again. Damien said that seemed unnecessarily harsh, given that none of this was personal. I laughed and said my wife conducting an affair and bringing her lover to my father's funeral felt extremely personal. Damien insisted he'd never intended to hurt me, that he and Rebecca had fallen in love and couldn't help their feelings. I said if he contacted me again, I'd file a harassment complaint. Damien hung up without saying goodbye. Rebecca sent me an email 6 weeks after the divorce was final. She said she and Damien had moved to Denver and were planning a small wedding in the spring. She said she hoped I'd found peace and could forgive her someday for how things ended. She said she'd always cared about me, even though we hadn't been right for each other. She asked if I'd consider sending her the photos from our wedding since she'd forgotten to make copies before leaving. I deleted the email without responding. Later that evening, I went through my computer and found the folder containing our wedding photos. I selected all of them and hit delete, then emptied the trash. Keeping those photos served no purpose, except to remind me of a marriage built on lies. I felt lighter after deleting them, like I'd finally severed the last connection to Rebecca. I started therapy in October, 5 months after my father's funeral. My therapist was a woman named Dr. Andrea Sullivan, who specialized in grief and divorce recovery. She had credentials from 2 universities and 20 years of clinical experience. Our first session focused on my father's death and how Rebecca's behavior had complicated my grieving process. Dr. Sullivan said I'd been dealing with 2 major losses simultaneously, my father and my marriage, and hadn't given myself space to process either one properly. She said the way Rebecca had centered herself during my father's funeral was a form of narcissistic behavior that had denied me the support I'd needed during a vulnerable time. We worked on techniques for managing grief without numbing it or avoiding it. Dr. Sullivan said I'd been so focused on practical matters like the divorce and estate settlement that I hadn't actually let myself feel the full weight of losing my father. In one session, I told Dr. Sullivan about finding my father's journal entries documenting Rebecca's suspicious behavior. Dr. Sullivan asked how it felt, knowing my father had suspected the truth but never confronted me about it. I said it felt like a betrayal at first, like my father should have warned me. But thinking about it more, I understood he'd been trying to protect me from pain he wasn't certain about. Dr. Sullivan said parents often walk a difficult line between protecting their adult children and respecting their autonomy. She said my father probably struggled with whether to share his suspicions without concrete proof. I said I wished he'd told me anyway so I could have investigated sooner. Dr. Sullivan pointed out that I might not have believed him or might have defended Rebecca if he'd raised concerns without evidence. She said I'd been deeply invested in my marriage and probably would have rationalized away any accusations. Through therapy, I started recognizing patterns in my relationship with Rebecca that I'd ignored while we were together. She'd always needed to be the center of attention at social gatherings. She'd gotten upset whenever I'd spent time with my family without her, claiming she felt left out, but she'd regularly made plans without including me. She'd criticize my hobbies and interests, calling them boring, while expecting me to enthusiastically support her activities. She'd managed our finances in a way that gave her control over most discretionary spending. Dr. Sullivan called these patterns controlling behaviors and said Rebecca had likely been manipulating me throughout our marriage in subtle ways I hadn't recognized at the time. Understanding this helped me feel less guilty about the divorce. I hadn't failed at marriage. I'd been in a relationship with someone who'd never fully committed to me. Ian called me on a Thursday morning in December and said he'd been contacted by someone from my father's estate attorney's office. The probate process was complete, and the estate would be distributed among the three of us according to my father's will. Ian had already signed his portion of the paperwork, and Olivia had signed hers remotely since she was back in Seattle. I needed to come to the attorney's office to sign final documents and collect my inheritance. I scheduled an appointment for the following Monday. The estate attorney, a man named Robert Thornton with 30 years of experience in probate law, walked me through each document explaining what I was signing. My father's estate was worth approximately $450,000 after the house sale and other assets were liquidated. Divided 3 ways, each of us would receive about $150,000. Robert handed me a sealed envelope along with the check for my inheritance. He said my father had left individual letters for each of his children to be delivered after the estate settled. I opened the envelope in my car outside the law office. My father's handwriting covered 3 pages. He wrote about how proud he was of me for finishing my graduate degree. He wrote about hoping I'd find happiness in my career and personal life. Then he wrote about Rebecca. He said he'd noticed things over the past few years that worried him about my marriage. He said he'd seen Rebecca's car in places it shouldn't be and watched her interact with other men in ways that seemed inappropriate for a married woman. He wrote that he'd almost told me his concerns multiple times, but had held back because he didn't want to interfere without being certain. He said if I was reading this letter, then he was gone, and he regretted not being braver about speaking up when he was alive. He hoped I'd forgive him for his silence. He ended the letter saying he loved me and trusted me to build a good life, regardless of what happened with Rebecca. I sat in my car crying for the first time since my father died. All the grief I'd been holding back for months came out in that parking lot while I clutched his letter. He'd known Rebecca was lying to me and had died without saying anything because he'd been trying to protect me or hadn't known how to start that conversation. I understood his choice but wished desperately that he'd trusted me enough to share his suspicions. Maybe if he had, I would have confronted Rebecca sooner and saved myself months of being deceived. Or maybe I would have refused to believe him and damaged our relationship over accusations I wasn't ready to accept. I'd never know what might have been different. I could only deal with what was true now. My father was gone. Rebecca was gone. I had to build a new life from what remained. 3 months later, I heard through mutual friends that Rebecca and Damien had gotten married in a small ceremony in Denver. Apparently, Rebecca had invited several people from her former workplace who'd attended, despite knowing she'd been having an affair. One of those friends, a woman named Julia, who I'd met at company events, reached out to me via social media. She said she'd felt uncomfortable at Rebecca's wedding, knowing what had happened to me. She said several guests had talked about how strange it was that Rebecca had married Damien so quickly after divorcing me. Julia said Rebecca had told people at the wedding that our marriage had been failing for years, and the divorce was mutual. She'd apparently reinvented the entire story to make herself look better. Julia thought I should know what Rebecca was saying about me. I thanked Julia for the information, but told her I'd moved on and wasn't interested in Rebecca's revisionist history. I'd started dating someone new in January, a woman named Claire, who worked as a physical therapist at the hospital, where my father had received treatment during his illness. We'd met when I'd gone back to the hospital to donate money in my father's name to their cancer research program. Claire had been in the lobby working with a patient when I'd walked in for my appointment with the fundraising coordinator. We'd started talking after my meeting and discovered we had similar interests in hiking and classical music. She'd asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime, and I'd said yes. Our first date had been casual and comfortable without any of the performance that had characterized my early relationship with Rebecca. Claire was straightforward and honest, and didn't play games. She knew about my recent divorce and my father's death, and didn't try to fix either situation, just listened when I wanted to talk and gave me space when I didn't. On a Saturday in February, Claire and I drove to the mountains for a day hike. The trail was steep and challenging, and the views at the summit were worth the effort. We sat on rocks overlooking a valley and ate sandwiches while hawks circled overhead. Claire asked if I ever thought about my ex-wife. I said occasionally, but less often as time passed. Claire said her ex-boyfriend had cheated on her 3 years ago, and she understood how long it took to rebuild trust in relationships. She said she'd gone to therapy and worked through her issues before starting to date again. She asked if I'd done therapy. I told her about Dr. Sullivan and the work we'd been doing on grief and trust and recognizing manipulation patterns. Claire said she was glad I'd taken time to heal properly instead of jumping into something new before being ready. I said I felt ready now, ready to build something real with someone who'd be honest with me. We hiked back down the mountain as the sun started setting and stopped at a small restaurant for dinner on the drive home. Over pasta and wine, Claire told me about her family and her career goals and the trip to Ireland she was planning for next summer. She asked if I wanted to come with her. I said yes, without hesitating. The idea of planning a future with someone who actually wanted me present for it felt revolutionary after years of being an afterthought in my own marriage. Claire reached across the table and took my hand. She said she knew it was still early in our relationship, but she wanted me to know she was serious about building something lasting. I said I was serious too. We finished dinner and drove back to my house where Claire had started keeping some clothes and toiletries for the nights she stayed over. Living alone in the house had been difficult at first, but I'd gradually made it mine. I'd painted the bedroom a different color and bought new furniture to replace what Rebecca had taken. I'd hung photographs of my family and artwork I'd chosen myself, rather than accepting whatever Rebecca had picked. The house felt like an authentic space now instead of a stage set. Claire liked it and said she could see me in every room. She'd helped me plant a garden in the backyard last month, and we'd spent weekends choosing vegetables and flowers and planning the layout. The physical work of digging in the dirt and building raised beds had been therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. Creating something living and new in the space I'd once shared with Rebecca felt like reclaiming territory. Ian and Melissa invited Claire and me over for dinner in March. It was the first time Claire had met my family in a formal setting. Olivia video called from Seattle to join us for dessert, and everyone got along easily. After Claire and I left, Ian texted saying he really liked her and thought she was good for me. He said it was obvious how happy I'd become in the past few months. Olivia sent a similar message saying Claire seemed genuine and kind, completely different from Rebecca. Having my family's approval mattered more than I'd realized. They'd never fully embraced Rebecca, and I'd always sensed their reservations, even though they'd tried to be supportive. With Claire, there was no hesitation or doubt from any of them. They could see what I saw, that this relationship was built on honesty and mutual respect, rather than deception and manipulation. In April, I received notification that Rebecca had filed paperwork to change her last name back to Damien's surname. It was a small detail that shouldn't have mattered, but it felt like the final confirmation that everything we'd built together had been erased. She'd literally removed my name from her identity. I mentioned it to Dr. Sullivan during therapy, and she asked how it made me feel. I said relieved, actually. Rebecca taking Damien's name meant she was fully committed to her new life and had no remaining connections to mine. Dr. Sullivan said that was a healthy perspective and showed how much progress I'd made in letting go of the past. She said many people would have felt hurt or angry about an ex-spouse changing their name, but I'd recognized it as closure. We talked about whether I was ready to end regular therapy sessions. I said I thought so. We agreed to transition to monthly check-ins rather than weekly appointments. The anniversary of my father's death arrived in late April. I'd been dreading it, knowing it would bring back memories of the funeral and Rebecca's betrayal. Claire offered to take the day off work to spend it with me, but I said I needed to do this alone. I drove to the cemetery early in the morning and sat by my father's grave. The headstone Ian and Olivia and I had chosen was simple gray granite with my father's name and the dates of his birth and death, and a line that read, "Beloved Father and Educator." I sat on the grass and talked to him the way Dr. Sullivan had suggested. I told him about the divorce and selling the house and meeting Claire. I told him I'd read his letter probably 50 times and understood why he'd stayed quiet about his suspicions. I said I forgave him for not telling me and hoped he'd forgive me for not seeing the truth sooner. I stayed there for over an hour before leaving flowers and driving to work. That evening, Ian and Olivia and I had dinner at the restaurant where we'd held my father's wake. It had seemed appropriate to mark the first anniversary of his death in the same place we'd gathered after his funeral. We shared memories and looked through photographs and talked about how much we missed him. Olivia said she'd been going through my father's journal and found entries about each of us that she'd copied and wanted to share. She'd found passages where my father had written about being proud of Ian's career and family. She'd found entries about worrying that she was working too hard and not taking care of herself. And she'd found more entries about me and Rebecca, including one dated just 2 weeks before he died. In that entry, my father had written that he'd prayed I'd find happiness, whether that was with Rebecca or someone else. He'd written that he could see I wasn't truly happy, but didn't know how to help without overstepping. Reading those words hurt, but also brought comfort. My father had wanted the best for me, even when he couldn't directly intervene. Summer arrived, and Claire and I took the trip to Ireland we'd planned. We spent 2 weeks exploring castles and coastlines and small villages. We hiked through green hills and drank local beer in traditional pubs and took hundreds of photographs. The trip felt like a reset, a clear break between the painful previous year and whatever future we were building together. On our last night in Dublin, Claire and I walked along the river at sunset, and she told me she loved me for the first time. I said I loved her too and meant it completely. We'd been together for 6 months at that point, and I'd spent that time learning who she really was without pretense or performance. She was exactly who she appeared to be, honest and kind and fully present. After years with Rebecca, who'd been hiding her true self, being with someone genuine felt like a revelation. We flew back home and returned to our normal routines, work and friends and weekends together. Claire had mostly moved into my house by August, though she kept her apartment as a safety net. I understood her caution and didn't push her to fully commit before she was ready. We fell into comfortable patterns, cooking dinner together most nights and taking turns choosing what to watch on television. Claire introduced me to her parents in September when they visited from out of state. Her father was a retired engineer like me, and we talked shop while her mother and Claire prepared dinner. They'd been married 35 years and had the kind of easy partnership my own parents had shared. After they left, Claire said her mother had pulled her aside and told her I seemed like a keeper. Claire had agreed. In October, I ran into Damien at a professional conference my engineering firm was sponsoring. I was in the convention center lobby when I saw him across the room talking to a group of people. My first instinct was to avoid him, but then I decided I didn't need to hide or feel uncomfortable. I'd done nothing wrong and had nothing to be ashamed of. I walked past his group on my way to a seminar and he saw me. He nodded slightly in acknowledgement and I nodded back, then kept walking. The exchange lasted maybe 3 seconds and felt anticlimactic after everything that had happened. Later, I saw him again in the hotel bar where conference attendees were gathering for happy hour. He was alone this time and approached me directly. He said hello and asked how I'd been. I said I'd been well. He mentioned he and Rebecca had moved back from Denver because his job opportunity hadn't worked out. I said that was too bad without much sincerity. Damien said he'd heard through mutual acquaintances that I was seeing someone new and he hoped I was happy. I said I was very happy, actually. We stood there for an awkward moment before he excused himself and walked away. I texted Claire about the encounter and she called me immediately asking if I was okay. I assured her I was fine, that seeing Damien had been strange but not upsetting. She said she was proud of me for handling it maturely. I realized I genuinely didn't care about Damien or Rebecca anymore. They'd both become irrelevant to my life. Whatever they were doing in Denver or wherever they'd moved didn't affect me. I had my own life now with someone who chose me first, instead of treating me like a backup option. That night, Claire came over and we made dinner together and watched a movie and went to bed early. The ordinary routine of being with her felt more valuable than any dramatic gesture Rebecca had ever made. Real love, I was learning, looked like consistency and honesty and someone who showed up when they said they would. 18 months after my father's funeral, Claire and I got engaged. I proposed on a beach during a weekend trip to the coast. I'd planned something elaborate, but when the moment arrived, I simply asked her to marry me while we were walking along the shore at sunset. She said yes, and we sat on the sand watching waves and talking about the future. We decided on a small wedding, just close family and friends, at a venue with views of the mountains. No big production or stress, just a meaningful ceremony celebrating our commitment. Ian and Olivia both offered to help with planning. Claire's parents were thrilled, and her mother started researching photographers immediately. Everything felt right in a way my first wedding never had. With Rebecca, there'd been an undercurrent of performing for other people. With Claire, everything was about us and what we actually wanted. We got married in May on a Saturday afternoon with 30 guests watching. The ceremony was outdoors in a garden with mountains visible in the background. Claire wore a simple white dress and looked radiant. I wore a suit and my father's wedding ring, which I'd had resized to fit my finger. Ian stood as my best man, and Claire's sister stood as her maid of honor. The officiant, a friend of Claire's from college who'd gotten ordained online, kept the ceremony brief and personal. We wrote our own vows and read them in front of our small gathering. I promised to always be honest and present, and to choose Claire first in every circumstance. She promised the same. When we kissed after being pronounced married, everyone cheered, and I felt completely certain I'd made the right choice. This was what marriage was supposed to feel like, a partnership with someone who actually wanted to be there. The reception was casual, dinner and dancing and toasts from family members. Ian gave a speech about how much I'd changed in the past 2 years, becoming more confident and happier than he'd ever seen me. Olivia talked about how Claire had brought light back into my life after a dark period. Claire's father welcomed me into their family and said he'd never seen his daughter so happy. We danced and ate cake and celebrated until late evening. No drama, no ex-spouses showing up uninvited, no family members treating anyone poorly, just genuine celebration with people who cared about us. Driving away from the venue at the end of the night, Claire and I held hands and talked about how perfect everything had been. We spent our wedding night at a hotel nearby and left the next morning for a honeymoon in Greece. 2 weeks later, we returned home to the house that had once been mine and Rebecca's, but was now ours. Claire had fully moved in before the wedding, and we'd redecorated completely. Every room reflected both of our tastes and choices. The ghosts of my first marriage were gone, replaced by new memories with someone who actually loved me. I'd learned that people show you who they are if you pay attention. Rebecca had shown me through years of small betrayals that I wasn't her priority. Claire showed me every day through consistent actions that I was. The difference was everything. I'd stopped wondering what I could have done differently with Rebecca and started appreciating what I had with Claire. My father had been right in his letter. I'd built a good life regardless of what happened with Rebecca. Actually, I'd built a better life because of what happened. The pain of that first marriage ending had forced me to examine what I actually needed in a partnership and to recognize it when I found it. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.